back to another episode of Coffee with April. This time, we're going to talk about origin. I have been in Kenya. Joe's been in Ethiopia.
Yep.
And there's some very interesting insights that we've been getting from these trips, and we want to share them with you. So we have a few different points we're going to run through, and we're going to give you kind of two different perspectives on a lot of the similar issues, actually, because I think both origins are complicated.
Yeah, in different ways, and that's what makes it so interesting, especially from our own sort of naive ideas that these were our first trips to Africa. It's been really interesting to see what the reality is for the coffee purchase supply chain, and also the major differences between two countries that we buy a large amount of coffee from.
Yeah, for sure. And we should say, for the sake of this kind of interview, just in general, I mean, we've been to these countries, but we haven't seen everything, right? So this is, portions, reflections on a very small portion of a much bigger country. So we're not going to claim that we know everything about these countries. We're just going to share the kind of insights that we had here.
I mean, if anything, it's as much that we still know very little. We know more than we did before we went on these trips. But a lot of these things are so that we can actually learn more. It's better for us to take what we've seen already and discuss it and try to develop a better understanding as opposed to just work with the preconceptions or the things that we may think that we've seen. So we're going to do that today. We're going to go through some of the differences, some of the similarities, what our personal opinions as well as sort of professional and the April approach would be to these things. But we also invite people that are watching to talk about their experiences as well, and maybe we can learn some more. So,
yeah, for sure. So I mean, you just comment down here as always. I think one of the first things that always comes to mind, one of the main reasons for us visiting these countries was traceability, right? How can we actually make sure that the coffee we're buying comes from, where it's supposed to come from? Because in both countries, what we see is this today massive cooperatives with, over 1,000 members. And one of the things that we are looking for the most is traceability, right? And when we say traceability, we mean down to a specific lot of coffee, right? So let's say we buy 30 bags of Ethiopian coffee. We want to be able to go to Ethiopia and basically see where that coffee is grown, right?
So we're talking about fully traceable. So in this case, when we talk about traceability, we're talking about going specifically into farms themselves or areas and looking at the plots and the trees. Is that actually manageable? Is that something that's possible? As opposed to traceable down to, say, a cooperative level. So that kind of leads to a question here, which would be, or is cooperative coffee fully traceable in that idea? I know you found some really interesting things in Kenya. I mean, it's scale-based.
Yeah, generally. I mean, it's first of all, one should keep in mind that the systems that are in place mainly due to making the most efficient logistic behind coffee, right? So
100%.
When you come to, first of all, Kenya and Ethiopia both have, in general, very small farmers in the sense that they don't grow a lot of coffee. So it makes sense to combine it. If you own a processing mill, that costs a lot of money, so it makes sense to process more people's coffee, right? So we're not against the idea that people are consolidating and trying to make it work together. What we don't like is the fact that we actually don't see a traceability, right? And what I see in Kenya, and I can say this with pretty much certainty, and I'm going to argue that anyone that argues differently are probably bullshitting a bit, but you can't get traceability. If you go to a cooperative with 500 plus members, there's no way they're going to be able to tell you exactly where that coffee comes from. I mean, we're at a level where some people bring the coffee to a process station on a donkey.
Right? 100%. I mean,
which is basically Ethiopia as well.
Yeah, so to kind of put a point to that would be my impression as well from Ethiopia. At one point I was out in the sort of forest area looking at trees, and I hear some people coming, and it's two guys with a mule and their cherries then strapped on, and then they're making their way to the washing station for submission. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to trace then. I mean, it's clearly the best for everyone in the current operation of the supply chain. The wet mill continues to have coffee submitted, and they want to be keeping this wet mill running 24 hours to make the full money out of it. It makes sense if you're going to invest in the equipment. And if you, as a farmer, can then transport yourself, you're saving yourself the cost there. So you're going to make the most from the margin that you're actually submitting. However, is there a consideration to where this particular coffee has been cultivated? Not necessarily. Then you might end up with this idea of, well, they're from this particular part of the region or this particular area, but it's very difficult to trace anything beyond that point. For us, working with the volumes that we work with, we don't necessarily need to buy from the larger cooperatives in that sense. If there is the possibility that we can buy from people that are working on a smaller scale, that does allow us to be traceable.
Sure.
So in this case, that might then mean a cooperative that has far fewer members. So I know you were talking about, for example, in Kenya, the potential for like a 20-person cooperative or something like this.
Yeah, I mean, there are some ideas. I mean, there's even some examples of single farmers that we kind of know and operate. We just perhaps don't like their coffee. And I know in Ethiopia it's coming as well, right? But I think, first of all, it's important to discuss, I mean, why in the world care in the first place?
Yeah.
Because part of the issue, which is also amazing, with both Kenyan and Ethiopian coffee is that by default, they're kind of delicious, right? So then it's like, why even question the fact? Because they are delicious. And historically, this part of the industry is validating what we do based on the cup quality, right? And April is at a point now where we've been visiting some other farmers that we work with, and we're so impressed with the traceability they work with the standards they have. Alejo at Volcanazo was a great example in Costa Rica. And then we go down to these other countries, and we see, even if the coffee quality can be good, the maintenance on the farm, the condition of the trees, the amount of pesticides, fungicides, all kind of shit is just completely, it's not even on the map or in the ballpark the way people do, right? So that's why we care. That's why we do this kind of in the first place. There are some really interesting options. We saw some great stuff in Kenya as well. And I think, for me personally at least, one of the main things behind why do we want traceability is, which brings us to another point, is varietals, which is not as much of an issue in Ethiopia. There is definitely potential there, but in Kenya, what we see now is that we see a bunch of hybrid varietals that are basically disease resistant in various ways, mainly focusing on leaf rust. We're talking Bathian, Ruri 11. There is a bunch of them. And I'm going to argue that they taste pretty inferior to the standard SO28, SO34. So my general argument with Kenya is that the coffee quality has declined over the last years. And a big part of that is the increasing mix of varietals on the farms, right?
But, so a sort of point to that would be, the question is, where is the influence coming from to plant these particular varietals? And is that also a factor in cooperatives? Essentially here, if a cooperative is operating under the idea that everyone is working together, everyone is submitting to the same lot, you would want some form of uniformity. The thing is for a cooperative to operate at its full potential, you want the highest yields. So it's this idea of that a cooperative, whilst still having its best interests at heart, which you can always say is then the best interests of the members of the cooperative, the farmers themselves, does it service the best interests of the quality of coffee? Not necessarily. And Kenya is an interesting thing for this, because for most cooperative, well, I say most, that's an assumption, but for a lot of cooperatives, they're working with, pesticide suppliers directly in this sense, or insecticide suppliers. That means subsidized pesticides and insecticides for all members of the cooperative. That then means that you're essentially within this system, not just in terms of growing coffee and submitting coffee, but in all different levels of agriculture. I mean, that can lead to difficulties as well. Surely, I mean, economies of scale makes it easier for cost, but that's not the only factor at play. So there's a potential here for...
It comes down to, and I'm not 100% sure how they played this in Ethiopia, but we said this before in a previous video in Kenya, whereas the issue in Kenya is that a wet mill then sells the coffee to a dry mill in 99% of the cases. And the dry mill pays based on parchment quality. Not on cup quality. There's two different things, right? So they buy a certain kind of parchment, and then they evaluate the cup score, and then something else happens, right? So there's obviously an issue with countries that are trading mainly on the visual appearance of something apart from the taste quality, right? And it's interesting with these varietals. I mean, we know they're coming up to make the farmers' lives easier. They should be able to yield higher. give a better, more secure financial situation, which we support 100%. But kind of back to Costa Rica, because I just been here, when we looked at the trees, the highest quality trees was SL28, which is like the varietal that should not be able to do very well, and the leaf resistant shit hybrids, which to be fair, some of them are tasty, were by far the worst condition in terms of trees, right? So that's an interesting discussion as well. One of the best farm experiences in Kenya was fully organic by Kenyan standards, which is not necessarily what we call fully organic, but it was a farm that only pushed SL28s and had the spacing between the trees were amazing, right? There was by far one of the lower yielding farms in the area because they're not going for volume, they're going for quality. But for me, there's very little correlation between what a cooperative is trying to push the farmer to do, which is creating a higher level of grade 1 parchment, versus someone that is like, I'm farming based on cup quality. And I think that's the difference I see in a lot of countries around the world versus cooperative structures. That's why at April we tend not to buy so much from cooperative structures in general.
I mean, the difficulties here are when we talk about the differences in supply chain. You reference now Alejo in Costa Rica. This is an example of a farmer that owns his own land, owns his own wet mill, owns his own dry mill, owns his own export license, can vac pack, ship out directly. I mean, he encompasses all areas of a coffee supply chain, actually. Still works with distributors in Europe, but up until that point, he's managing everything, as opposed to, for example, Colombia, then you might have that broken into phases, right? So you might still then process a farm separately, but you would then process that in a wet mill and then keep those lots separate through somebody else's dry mill and then send those out for export. Kenya and Ethiopia is going to be very different. The idea and the expectation of even a farmer owning their own land that's large enough to cultivate a crop that could be considered to be a singular lot or enough to actually process is incredibly difficult. And then it's the expectation of them to own essentially a hand pulping machine to be able to work with that. It's understandable why the cooperative model is the predominant. So that's always going to create a challenge, but it does then mean that the rest of the supply chain in Ethiopia, I'm not sure about Kenya, but the scale is huge, which makes it very difficult to utilize those parts of the supply chain for the kind of things that we would be looking for. So even if we were to then go out and identify, say, like a 20-member cooperative that's growing garden coffee, they're bringing that then through a wet mill. Well, the wet mill is like, they're processing such a volume of coffee that their discrepancy is probably larger than the full lot of our coffee. The same goes for a dry mill, which means if we were to actually then put that through one, put that through another, come back and pick that coffee up at the end, we wouldn't really have a certainty that that coffee is the coffee that we sourced initially, because the scales are just too large.
Yeah, and especially we've seen that in Ethiopia. There's been some amazing historical processing stations like Durumina, Biftigudina, that Nanoshala produce the best tasting coffees you could ever find from that country. Today you try their coffee and they're not very good because they're overproducing, right? And I mean, first of all, a cooperative model is amazing. We're not sitting here giving shit to a cooperative model.
No.
What we're saying is that why in the world are we allowing them to sell us coffee without giving us traceability? Because in theory, you should be able to. There's a bit of paperwork. You should actually be able to trace a lot without that much difficulty. It's just a matter of a bit more work. And I think we're justifying this by the fact that the coffee is tasty. And as long as the coffee is tasty, we're not asking any questions, right? And I think that's a very, very big issue in terms of how we push things in the industry. But I mean, keep in mind, and it's pretty naive to think otherwise, if someone buys a dry mill or a wet mill, I mean, dry mills are mainly owned by exporters, right? Because there's a connection. And then a wet mill can be owned by someone else, sometimes an exporter, but often someone more independent. These machines are really expensive.
Incredibly expensive.
It's like when you buy a roaster, right? You don't buy a roaster to roast one day a week. You buy a roaster because you want to roast 7 days a week, right? Because you spend a lot of money in machinery. And it's the same for a dry mill or a wet mill. So their job is kind of, let's fill that wet mill as much as we can.
Yeah, you want to maximize
to make
it
back money,
completely.
right? Which is also, to be fair, makes all the sense in the world, right? It's just that we all know that mass production, or for any unit, whether it's a roastery, a wet mill, a dry mill, for anyone that is producing up until the capacity of what they can, that's usually not the best way to produce quality.
No. I mean,
and I think we've seen that.
To give you a good example of why this becomes maybe a difficulty for us or a challenge, would be if we highlight one of the lots that we bought from Ethiopia last year that was a specifically designated farm lot. So we could...
Zebde.
Yeah, Zebde. So Zebde is a particular varietal. It's from a particular part of the farm. All those trees were planted at the same time. They were spaced the same way. The pickings will have been taken over a period, but then that was picked from the same lot and processed fully naturally on the beds. And this would have been at a metad station called Bishanfugu, which is in the Guji region. And Bishanfugu only deals with fully natural coffees. So they have several of these farm areas. They also take in other cooperative coffee, and they process full naturals. About 5-10 minute walk from there is the Alaka washing station, also owned by Metad. They're producing a large volume of fully washed coffee. They've got a 2-barrel Panagos system that they're working with. That's on 24 hours a day. One of the things we spoke about immediately after my visit was, can we take what we did in Bishanfugu and can we put that through Alaka essentially to create a traceable, farm-grown, wash process coffee?
Yeah.
And the answer is, it may be possible, but is the value really there? I mean, it's, as we already mentioned, the scale is so large that we're not necessarily guaranteed to get the coffee that we chose. It would end up blended in with a lot of other coffee just because of the way that the system works. And at the same time, again, they would most likely need to halt what they're doing in terms of their production, create so much unnecessary disruption that essentially it's going to cause more problems for everyone.
Yeah.
So right now, our conclusion is, okay, then we focus on the highest quality natural process coffees that we can that are fully traceable. It does create a lot of questions. It's something that we never really considered until we were there in that sense, which is an interesting learning.
Yeah, I mean, the important question here is, what's the most important part, right? Is that traceability for your coffee, or having a coffee that you always love, right? Not saying that we don't like naturals, but I think most people following in April knows that we're not a huge fan of naturals, right? But as Joe say as well, there's a reason why people are pitching single farmer Ethiopian coffees. It's a reason why that often happens to be a natural coffee now. I mean, Tim Endebo just pushed like 3 natural coffees this year, which is like, has he ever done that before? No, but he does it because that's how he gets a single farmer Ethiopian. So he makes a decision there, right? Not saying I know anything about how he trades coffee, but obviously it's important that there's a traceability and a single farmer in that, right? And I'm kind of bound to move in a similar direction there. I mean, we're still this close to cut off Kenya, which I hate because I love Kenyan coffees. But the lack of traceability is, for me, it doesn't make sense because such a big part of what we do is actually working with farmers that has an expression, or producers that has an expression. I mean, I think both Burundi and Rwanda is easier in terms of traceability than a lot of the other parts of the world, right?
I mean, these are farms as well that, when we talk about, for example, Bishanfugu and Alaka, there's a lot of their coffees around Europe. You'll find their coffees in many different places. It's a very high volume. At the same time as I'm visiting, they're also installing Panagos dryers. So, but at the same time, they're talking about acquiring more land, producing more traceable lots of specifically planted things and the kind of things that they know that we're interested in as a business. They obviously had no reason to pitch us the mechanical dryers. But then you go, okay, but the business plan here is in 2 separate directions at the same time that actually seem to be of some contradiction to some extent. I mean, maybe there's a learning here. I know that Alejo, for example, he does utilize mechanical dryers to stabilize coffee.
Yep.
Maybe this is an example of where sort of mass production and the smaller sort of batch lots can benefit each other to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, on the paper, but I mean, in theory, one should say a mechanical dryer you use because you want to dry faster,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
That's really, or you have a really unstable climate.
Sure. I mean, essentially, I read it as maximizing growth.
Yeah.
But in the same way that you read the idea of acquiring land as also maximizing growth, but you're just growing in a different demographic.
Yeah.
You're growing in the now growing demographic of coffee roasters that want fully traceable farm-grown coffee as opposed to co-ops.
I mean, the real challenge will always be, it so often comes down to drying, because again, the coffee is pulled the same day it's picked often. Then in Kenya or Ethiopia, often they soak it for maybe 12 hours a day, and then they more or less dry it.
Yeah.
It's not more complicated than that. But the challenge is, and was that Bruno describing that to us once? I don't know. Bruno is a partner farmer in Brazil, but he basically said that it doesn't matter if I produce 2 containers or 20 containers of coffee, they're all picked, processed within the same 3 months every year, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the challenge we have here. The more coffee someone is producing, the more space they need, or the faster they need to process the coffee.
Sure.
That's the only 2 options. There's no other way, because the coffee needs to be picked within a certain time, which in both Ethiopia and Kenya will start basically end of November and finish in December, and then they go on processing, and then they need to pack, export, and ship, right? So there's an obvious challenge here with anyone that wants to grow their business from a wet mill perspective, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why we see so many of those stations just growing to not producing very tasty coffee, because they're rushing it, right? And that's not a good way to taste coffee. No.
To continue listening to the extended version of this discussion, as well as additional interviews and resources, check out our podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, or Spotify. Thank you for listening.